Good evening. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I am Jonathan Visbal, your moderator for this evening. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest. Jonathan Berman is a senior fellow at Columbia University's Vale Center and senior advisor to Dalberg, a strategic advisory firm focused on frontier markets with 10 offices worldwide. He has advised numerous global Fortune 500 companies on entry and operations in emerging and frontier markets, focusing on the political and economic dynamics that drive shareholder value. Challenges on which he has supported clients include assessing political and social risk in new ventures, developing strategy for entering emerging and frontier markets, engaging host governments and civil society on national development challenges, developing local supply chains, preventing crises in frontier markets and navigating through them when they occur, and advising boards and senior executive teams on sustained growth in emerging and frontier markets. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a graduate of Yale University and UC Berkeley. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jonathan Berman.
Thanks, Jonathan. I've rarely been so proud to come out in front of an audience and announce that I'm a UC Berkeley grad. It's been quite a while since I've been able to say that with great pride. I'd also point out that Jonathan and I were talking a little bit before, and his own expertise and experience across Africa is both broad and quite deep. So I would encourage Jonathan to also draw on his expertise in our discussion today. I'd like to echo Joshua's sentiments in thanking Dalberg and Joe Doherty for hosting the event, along with Jane Wales and the World Affairs Council. And it's a pleasure to be here. I've been in the audience and learned often from the people on this stage. It's my opportunity now to both perhaps offer some lessons and also learn from you. I'm going to be a little brief in my remarks because it's a large group and because I think there's a lot of knowledge in the audience. So if I'm a little short in my upfront comments, I promise to expound a bit in the question and answer period. I was listening to an investor conference a few days ago with Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, the chairman of Google, and Eric was asked why he had been spending so much time in Africa. And the questioner sort of framed it as a philanthropic endeavor, as a personal level of interest. And Eric's response was, I'm in Africa as often as I am because we're getting more click-throughs from Africa than we do from Europe. More click-throughs on Google ads in Africa than in Europe. And it was a surprising answer to a lot of the people on the call. There was another similar event that happened to me recently that surprised even me. The energy company BP puts out an occasional forecast on energy worldwide, and they did so earlier this week as well, energy forecast to 2035. Now, this is a universally read document in the energy sector and indeed in economic forecasting. These are some people who put a lot of resources into making their best bets about where growth in the world is going to happen, where energy demand and supply will occur. And, given the nature of my book, I flipped immediately to the Africa section expecting to read a little bit about the African supply story, because Africa's got a lot of oil and gas that's been recently discovered, which they noted. And they said, this on balance is going to allow Africa to remain more or less at the same level of total delivery, total supply to the rest of the world as they've been. That is to say, they've been at about 4% of total supply of oil and gas, and that's where they'll be even as shale comes on here, et cetera. So they'll remain level on supply. However, Africa will be the fastest growth in demand of any region in the world over the next 2 decades. They will have a faster rate of growth in demand for energy than Asia, than the US in its recovery, than any region in the world. That's a new story and a surprising story. And they went on to talk about how BP themselves are planning for it. And it's really actually a story that you begin to hear from a lot of people who have been extracting from Africa, that now they're beginning to perceive Africa as a place where they're going to be utilizing those resources, deploying those resources, finding markets, not just commodities to withdraw. And it's a surprising story for many. It's a surprising story in part because that's not the Africa most of us grew up knowing. I mean, there's people of various ages here, but I certainly grew up in a time when Africa was a place where there were only happy animals and miserable people, right? That's what I grew up knowing about Africa. And that was an image that was reinforced, and to a certain extent is still reinforced by our popular media and by our news media, by entertainment, and I would even say to a certain extent by political and even donor, even civil society forces. There's a wide body of constituents in perpetuating the notion that Africa is a place of hopelessness. And even though that story is changing, it changes slowly, and it's deeply embedded in us. That's really why I wanted to write the book that I wrote. I've been doing business in Africa for about 10 years, and everyone who would come with me on the flights into Lagos or Nairobi or Accra would all know that Africa has been growing. Africa actually has had a growth trajectory for about that long, for about 10 to 13 years, depending on the country. And so when I would come back to the States on the first leg of the flight into London or Frankfurt, you were surrounded by people who knew that story. But then I'd get on that second leg from Frankfurt or London back to my home in New York, or more recently in Washington where we live, and no one on that leg would know that story. And I would test this out by asking people on either side of me, what do you know about the place I just came from? And the disconnect between that first leg out of Africa and that next leg back to the States was jarring, and I thought interesting and an opportunity, to tell a story that people didn't know, and one that I thought was important, not just for Africa, but for America. I think there, as we'll discuss, I think there's opportunity for America, for American companies to achieve growth, but also for American companies to sort of recapture a spirit of innovation and daring that is a little bit lost in much of the country, which I think is alive and well in the growth story of Africa. As I say, it was a story that surprised me when I first came to it about 10 years ago. I wasn't born in Africa, and I didn't start my career that way. I was a strategy consultant in Asia for about 10 years before that, for the first half of my career. And while in Asia, I got exposed sort of serially to fast growth markets, to the look and feel and smell of what a fast growth frontier market looked like. And it was when I had a client who was in Asia ask me to go to Africa for the first time that I first discovered the same thing there. You can't spend an hour in a city like Lagos, the commercial capital of Nigeria, and not feel that same buzz, that same energy and entrepreneurialism. There's a perception perhaps that Africa is in some way less entrepreneurial than Asia. Well, I've spent a lot of time in both places. That is not true. I've literally seen a road cut through the jungle of an African country, and the next day, seen it lined with stalls, as people literally were coming out of the villages to create commerce and grow. It's a diversified growth. That first client, you can sort of see it in my own personal trajectory. So that first client that brought me to Africa was an oil company. They actually were a Houston-based company that found an enormous deposit of natural gas in a country called Equatorial Guinea. That suddenly meant that a third of the company's valuation was there. They were essentially overnight moved from being a Houston-based company to being a African-based company. And the guys in Houston were a little bit perplexed by what had just happened. So they had brought me on to assist them in building out their local supply chains. There were a variety of reasons then, as now, to build out a set of local suppliers to support the project. I will say that what they had been doing to up to that point, and this shows you where things were when I started, up to that point they were meeting their local supply requirements with gradient. Now, not many people know what gradient is. For those who don't know, it's literally dirt. They were buying dirt at a premium in order to meet their requirements for local procurement. Let me fast forward to the last engagement I had, the conversation I had this morning with a client interested in Africa. That client is a tech leader, one of the top 5 tech firms in the United States, who are making a multi-year, multi-hundred million dollar commitment to Africa. And their primary interest is in identifying what technology demands Africa will have over the coming 3 decades. That's the question they're asking. So it's a long way from buying dirt at a premium. And you'll see things all, the growth throughout Africa it covers a full range in between. There's, the natural resources is still part of the story, but it's a minority. It's about 24% of the growth over the last 10 years has been in the natural resource sector. 3/4 has been in the non-oil or gas or mineral economy. And that includes IT, like I described. It includes an enormous amount of construction, both of people's homes and of the infrastructure that connects those homes. It includes retail and consumer growth. It includes, it includes virtually every aspect of a new economy coming to bear. If you think a little bit about what America might have been in the late 18th century, that in many ways is a reasonable way for Americans to take hold of what is happening in Africa now. For good and for ill. Those were hard times. There were a lot of hard times to our economic growth here, and they're facing very similar challenges. There are many differences, but I find that that's one way, one lens through which I'm able to understand what's happening in Africa. I should say that growth is driven by a lot of factors, but there's 3 that stand out to me. And I'll just run through them quickly with some stories of some of the African leaders that I know who are experiencing that growth and helping to drive it. The first is a change in governance. So I'll summarize these. I see a revolution in governance, a change in education, and an explosion of communication. Governance, education, and communication are the 3 biggest drivers I see growing Africa today. In governance, there was a generation, broadly speaking, and Africa is a big place moving at different trajectories, but I will for now speak in broad terms. There was a generation that liberated Africa and governed by virtue of the mandate they received during liberation. That generation, in large part, has passed, and possibly even the generation after them has passed, with the exception of South Africa, frankly, whose liberation, ironically, came later, 30 years later, than the rest of the continent. As that generation passed, the mandate came from a different source. It came from not the ability to liberate, but the ability to govern. And it's come slowly, but it's coming strongly now. And so, for example, I think about my friend James Mawaria, who leads a real estate development company in Nairobi. And he says he's developing a middle-income, mixed-use commercial and residential city on the outskirts of Nairobi. Much needed for a very overcrowded town. And James says, the reason I'm able to develop that town is because I know the infrastructure is coming. And I know the infrastructure is coming because the government plan, what's called Vision 2030, says it's coming. And both I and my investors know that we can rely on that statement because we can look at past events that the plan called for and see that they've been delivered. And that's something that's bankable. That's something I can take. That's something I can take to my management team, and something I take to my investors. And on the back of that certainty, James is able to raise $150 million for the first stage of that project. That could not have happened 15 years ago in Kenya. I think about education as well, and here I think about probably no one as much as my partner and friend at Dalberg, James Mwangi, who's the current general managing partner of Dalberg, an advisory firm where I've worked for the last 6 years. James's father was an engineer, trained in Kenya, an airline engineer, but James got a scholarship to essentially a magnet school in Nairobi, and then went on to apply to and get into Harvard, completed his BA, worked here for 2 years for McKinsey, and then went home to help build both Kenya and South Africa, where he lives now. James is not the only man like that. There's a cadre of men like James Mwangi who have returned to Africa with an outstanding education. There's a complementary cadre of people who have been educated all the way through in Africa from a small but growing group of secondary and tertiary institutions that have produced not a continent of highly educated people. The data doesn't support that, but a cadre, a class, an emerging class of highly trained technocratic people in both public and private sector that are able to drive performance to the next level across the continent. And then finally, communications. I would think that most people in this room are familiar with the mobile communications revolution in Africa. To put it just in stark sort of data terms, in the year 2000, penetration of mobile telephony was virtually nil, about 7% of the populace. This year, it will it'll be in the high 80s, possibly as high as 90% penetration. To put it in geographic terms, I mentioned to you that I've done work with some of the extractive sector. So when you do that kind of work, you have the benefit of going to some pretty remote places. So I've been to so you can go into a minor capital of Africa, fly from there about 600 kilometers inland by private charter jet, and then drive an additional 3 hours on roads of decreasing quality out to where you are basically in the most remote parts of Africa, to homes that are literally made exclusively of mud and thatch roof, where people have very little, and every single person in that village has access to a cell phone. Every single one. That's the level of penetration of mobile communication. And what does it do? It allows people to jump borders. We talk about that as leapfrog technology. And of course, it's leaping over landline technology that we have here. But that doesn't really matter so much. It doesn't matter so much that someone in Africa can leap over the technology that I was raised on in the Bronx. What matters is that they can leap the bounds of their prior lives. They can communicate with the people, with the people at market 30 miles away and know what the market price is. They can receive mobile payments in some parts of the continent from their son or daughter that's working in the city without the son or daughter having to travel back or rely on other unreliable means of transport. In short, they can jump the bounds that previously held them to just as far as they could walk. That's what a communication revolution really means, and that's what leapfrogging technology really means in Africa. So all three of these, governance, education, and communication, amongst other things, they have in common that they are led by Africans. And I think that's something that we tend to lose sight of when we talk about Africa. That this is not primarily a success driven by external entities or external forces. For one thing, I think we have a tendency to think that the growth in Africa is due to the Chinese in one form or another. It's due to China's appetite for commodities. It's due to Chinese investment in the continent, both of which are important catalysts to growth. But there is no case that can be made to say that those are the exclusive or definitive drivers of growth in Africa. You can just look at too many countries that aren't exporting resources to Africa. You can just look at too many successful CEOs in Africa who are not Chinese, who are themselves African, African born and bred, to think that really this success flows from any place but Africa itself. It's also not the U.S. that's been the generator of success in Africa, nor indeed, in my view, generally donors from the West. I'm not of the view that official development assistance is overwhelmingly harmful. I am of the view that it has done a lot of good, but I don't think it's the driver of Africa's current commercial rise. I think that there's sufficient evidence to show that it has generated a certain dependency in some countries that in my view, if it doesn't retard development, it puts a cap on how far it can go based only on donor-driven, external-driven incentives. Fundamentally, what you find is Africa is growing because Africans are demanding it and creating the opportunity for it. I think that's all to the good. To the good because it means it's self-sustaining, but also to the good because I find that Africans are developing not only their own sense of their own growth, but in some ways are redefining what growth can look like. Africa is not the only place around the world where inequality is a significant concern, and inequality of growth. That things, you hear a lot about that now, that the Africa Rising story, some of which I've told tonight, is one which leaves behind many millions. That's true, but that's true here as well, and it's certainly true in Europe. And increasingly, we're seeing how it's true in large parts of Asia. So that's a global phenomenon, a global problem. What I find is that in Africa, which has been largely detached from our prior models of capitalism, there's at least the opportunity and certainly the appetite to develop a new model of capitalism. I heard one U.S. CEO say to me that he sort of felt that Africa was a battlefield for the U.S. style of capitalism versus the Chinese style of capitalism. I respect that guy a lot, but I think he's completely wrong. If you talk to Africans, they have a very specific idea of their style, of developing their model of capitalism, what one of them described as Afro-capitalism, a means in which they're investing deeply in projects that deliver social wealth to the country alongside economic wealth. While you hear that in many places, I think it's more true in Africa because the opportunity there's few places where there are more opportunities to bring those two together. The overlap of the two exists everywhere, but no place do the opportunities overlap as strongly as they do in Africa. There'll always be people selling luxury goods to the ultra elites, right? Selling Louis Vuitton bags and Maseratis to people in Africa. That's true, but that's not where the bulk of the economic opportunity lies. The bulk of the economic opportunity lies in delivering productivity-enhancing, life-enhancing goods to a very large group of people. Goods like power, goods like information technology, goods like broadband. These are wide swaths of the economy that are just now developing and create that opportunity for both social wealth and economic wealth. And to me, that's really what's the most inspiring thing about working in Africa, is that you have the opportunity to sort of relive the openness and creativity that has occurred in many places, but in this continent, about 100, in the 19th century. But you also have the opportunity to take all that we've learned from the last 100 years, and even in the last 6 or 7 years, and apply it towards a better form of what businessmen and women are doing around the world. So with that, why don't I pause and take some of your questions? Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jonathan. You've written, I don't know how many people have had the chance to read the book or take a look at it, but I think it's interesting in that you really address, first of all, a continent, not on a country-by-country basis. And actually, when I look inside here, and I think it's on page 3 for those of you who have the book, he's got a map of the continent of Africa. And in this continent, inside of it, you can fit China, India, the United States, Eastern Europe, and much of Western Europe. That shows you how big the continent is. And the continent is comprised of 54 different countries. So there's got to be a lot of differences between those countries. So why did you say, let's go after Africa as a whole, as opposed to saying, let's go after the drivers of growth like a South Africa or Nigeria with its oil boom?
I don't think I've had a conversation about the book in which this question has not come up, and not always as nicely as Jonathan's put it. There's no doubt the experts on Africa are very quick to point out that Africa is not a country, and in part because it so often has been mistaken as a single whole and painted with a single brush. The reason that I chose to write about success in Africa as a whole, and I have a whole chapter on this, on is there an Africa, is because I think that if you looked only at the national markets, and as Jonathan said, there's 54 or 55, depending on who's counting, there's 54 or 55 of them, you would get granularity, but you would miss the entire picture. For one thing, from an investor perspective, 55 small markets are fundamentally not that interesting. And if you, as an investor or as a corporation, if you were looking at these markets that way, you would almost certainly limit your activities to the biggest of those markets: Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, maybe Ethiopia, and you'd probably stop there. So I think from Africa's perspective, it doesn't serve Africa particularly well to insist that people think about it in national markets. From the investor's perspective, beyond that, you would be missing the reality that there, in fact, is a strong African identity, and that is driving a lot of cultural, economic, and political activity, and it's driving it more and more each year. There's a story that one of the CEOs in the book told, and it was of the World Cup that was held in South Africa. What year was that? 2000? I mean, 2008, 2010. He experienced something that we experienced at Dalberg. That while every country was rooting for their country, the reality was that as countries got eliminated, as African countries got eliminated, they all rallied behind the remaining African country, which was Ghana at that time, right? As Ghana moved forward, as he put it, and he's from Kenya, the opposite side of the continent, we were all Ghanaians. And you'd see texts moving amongst Africans, rooting on Ghana more and more. You see this also amongst young entrepreneurs. So I spent some time with members of the African Business Club at Harvard Business School in writing the book, and not one of them had an ambition to be dominant in their own country, to build an enterprise that was going to be the greatest in their own country. Not one of them mentioned that. They all had ambitions for Africa as a whole. And I saw that, you see that more and more. That's a trajectory from an earlier time. The earlier model of African business leadership was really one of what we call what political economists would call rent seeking. You develop a strong relationship with the government. You'd maintain you'd capture certain parts of the economy in a monopoly or a near monopoly, and you'd extract value from the rest of the economy as long as you could. That's a viable model in one country. And as a result, very few companies in Africa for most of the 20th century extended beyond one country if they were African based. That is decreasingly true. And the 30-odd companies that you'll read about in Success in Africa are all reaching beyond that model. As companies begin to run productive, competitive enterprises, they begin to reach beyond those bounds because those bounds don't limit what they can do. Right, they constrain what they can do, and so you see the current and rising crop of African entrepreneurs, all spanning beyond their country to get a broader transnational vision. Sometimes that's not continent-wide. Sometimes it's regional, and there are 6 trading blocks in Africa, and that's not a bad way to think about the continent. But increasingly, it's just expanding outwards, at least to the bounds of the continent. So. In the end, I found myself thinking about Africa as a whole, but as a differentiated whole.
So I'm a businessman. I'm going into Africa, and I'm going to say, okay, where am I going to deploy my capital to do this? There's a lot of variability on a country-by-country basis. You've got some that are very, very advanced, like South Africa, that have, it's really a very developed infrastructure. You have adequate power supply. You have adequate communications. You have a good banking industry. But you can go to other countries, like I'll take, for example, Zimbabwe, that used to be at the top end, but you've had a corrupt ruler there, that being Robert Mugabe for many, many years, who has really held the country down. So you're going in to invest, and I can see if you're going to do basic infrastructure, such as roads, coming in to do power, coming in to do telecommunications. But to me, that's a precursor for growth in other areas. So where would you deploy your capital? Which countries? You can't do them all at once, and you have 54 countries. So is it better to go to some of the more developed ones, or because they're going to have unequal growth rates?
Right. So there's several there's several angles I would take on your question. The first is that I think the most of the companies that I've seen going from outside Africa into Africa that are doing it successfully think of it on a regional basis. They look at most likely those 6 trading blocks I mentioned and prioritize at least and organize based on those. They use those as an organizing principle for where they're going to put their people and how they're going to understand those markets. Within those 6 trading blocks, they then get down to national considerations like you're describing. I might argue with how the considerations were lined up by you. So, for example, I think the ones that are most successful are the ones that look beyond preconceived notions of those regions to what those regions are becoming now. And I'll give 2 examples. South Africa, which in my view is becoming less and less a part of Africa, and North Africa, which is becoming more and more a part of Africa. So I think that many companies come into, look at the African market and think of South Africa as the appropriate entrepot into the rest of the continent. And certainly South Africa tends to see itself that way. I don't know any African CEOs who are not South African who think that is so. Right, so there's a certain disconnected reality there. The truth is that apartheid and post-apartheid reaction in South Africa to the rest of Africa has significantly separated South Africa from the remainder of the continent, culturally and economically. So much, and it's not. It has not gotten better in the way I think many people imagined in the years since the end of apartheid. For a variety of reasons. The result is that South Africa is increasingly divorced from the rest of Africa, and you'll find alternative centers of growth, alternative regional capitals, Nairobi in particular, Accra, Lagos. These are all in countries that are growing faster than South Africa, but as capitals themselves of regional growth, they're contesting Johannesburg and Cape Town as a growth center for the entire region. North Africa, conversely, has always been thought of as separate from sub-Saharan Africa. I think most people think of Morocco or Algeria as more akin to the Middle East than it is to the rest of Africa. There are ties of language and kinship and culture to the Middle East, but the ties to the rest of Africa are much stronger than are widely recognized or even really publicly documented. Trade ties from Morocco down to the rest of French-speaking Africa are strong and growing. If you look at company after company in Morocco or Algeria, Attijara Wafa Bank, one of the largest banks in Africa, the largest bank in North Africa, their entire growth strategy is south-facing, not north-facing, not Middle East. South-facing. Sevital, the largest company in Algeria, their entire growth strategy, south-facing. SAH, which just had the most, is a maker of paper goods, paper products, and just had the most successful IPO in Tunisian history. Their entire growth trajectory is south. So those regional distinctions are sort of new and emerging, or at least newly recognized. And I think the companies that are really running ahead of the pack in Africa recognize them. So it's not exactly the question you asked, but it's my particular take on it.
And so there is still inequality amongst the countries, and within the countries there's inequality on the people. In terms of you have a rural base that's trying to move into kind of an entrepreneurial middle class. Do you really have the seeds of entrepreneurialism so that people can go out and really create a business and create a livelihood for themselves? Does that really exist across the African continent? Or, when you think of the drivers of the growth, is it really construction power, the large infrastructure, but how are the people getting pulled along?
My observation, I have not been in a country, not just an African country. I've not been in a country where there isn't an entrepreneurial impulse. I suppose that there are, some other people may differ with that, but even in the sleepiest countries I found that there's people who are prepared to be entrepreneurs, and then there's people who are not. And that applies here as well. I think that's just a cultural question that sort of I think bears iteration. But to your question of how this brings along a large group of people. My answer is it's uncertain. It's tough. I don't want to say that this is a done deal or that Africa is doing it better than the rest of the world. I will say that some of the bigger issues that you mentioned, Jonathan, like production of power, is an engine of growth for everybody. I don't want to say that a rising tide lifts all boats. That is not necessarily the case. In fact, I think events of the last 30 years and economic trends clearly prove it doesn't have to be the case at all. But I do think that the provision of primary infrastructure, roads, power, and social infrastructure like education and health are critical building blocks to raising people out of poverty. I don't know that any of these is a solution for inequality, and I guess my political bent is not to think that inequality is a problem. Poverty is a problem. And so when I look for what solutions would matter, what solutions I would want to see companies invest in, they're ones not necessarily that would decrease inequality, but ones that would significantly address the much more serious problem of raising the destitute out of poverty.
Right. And you mentioned that when you go to some of these small towns, too, everybody's got a cell phone there. Is there the necessary microfinancing to be able to help people start businesses? Because one of the things that I saw when I was in many of the African countries is people would get a cell phone, they would have some type of charging device, it was typically solar, and then they would rent that out as a business so that other people could come and charge their cell phones during the day,
right,
or set up some type of internet service.
Right, right. So that sort of cell phone as a business tool, like a kiosk, like you're saying, a business service, does still exist. My sense is, and there may be other people in the room who know this better. My sense is that business model is decreasing as more and more people have access to their own cell phone and subscription. Right, it becomes less of a sort of a communal service and more of direct access. That doesn't speak. So that business model is changing. That doesn't take away from, I think, a fundamental point that you're making, that access to finance is in tremendously short supply, and there's at extraordinary levels of the economy. So with the exception of the very largest firms, companies really struggle to find capital, and those few firms, conversely, oddly, those few firms that can garner capital are being chased by every private equity firm that's flooding into Africa. So access to finance is a critical element of that growth story at all levels. It's predicated really on nothing more, in my view, than documentation, information. Who are you? What do you own? What are you selling? What are you buying? These are things that are now coming available largely through a cell phone, because you're doing so many of those transactions on a cell phone that they can be documented. You know, one of the more interesting CEOs that I met in the course of writing the book is Ken Njoroge, a software engineer who runs a firm called Cellulant in Nairobi and in Lagos. And Cellulant is developing a very inexpensive, essentially mobile wallet, a program that works on the phone that documents the transactions of a farmer. And it documents those transactions for free to the farmer, because they're selling that information on to a variety of people who are interested in what the farmer is doing. But it has the secondary effect of providing the farmer with sufficient documentation of their costs and their revenues that they can then go and get a loan based on that.
So let's talk a little bit about governance. You mentioned that governance is one of the precursors to really the stability that's happening in Africa. Yet, you know, what we read about, especially in the Western press all the time, is the corruption. A lot of corruption in terms of how you get business done, again, on a country-by-country basis. You look at Captain Phillips and what happened in, you know, Somalia and East Africa, and you mentioned early on in your speech that, wow, America's losing their kind of entrepreneurialism to go after these frontier lands, but there's a lot of people who still feel that it's not safe. And can I go into these countries, especially ones that there's a lot of lawlessness? Talk a little bit about the whole, you know, change in governance and what's going to mitigate that corruption that we've all read about.
So before I talk about corruption in anybody else's country, I do like to at least acknowledge that I'm not sanguine about the level of corruption and fair play in our own governments at all levels. You know, I moved about 18 months ago to Washington D.C. And it's a swamp, not just in terms of geography. And in fact, I point out in the book to just a brief snippet that one can hear from Ira Glass's This American Life that captures in about 4 minutes the level to which we sort of have formalized, institutionalized what I think is unquestionably called corruption in this country. So I don't speak from a place of hubris on this. Having said that, there is widespread corruption in Africa to varying degrees in varying places across the continent. But I think it is fair to say that it's widespread. I think that it is also fair to say that one can operate cleanly within it. And I don't say that as a matter of sort of personal opinion. I say that based on talking to 30 CEOs who have all succeeded in Africa, and to a man and woman, including several American CEOs, say that the following: listen, you can operate corruptly here and do well, but you can also operate cleanly and do well. And the path to do that used to be quite narrow, but with every additional company that comes in and insists on operating in accordance with what we would call uncorrupt practices, with each company that comes in and operates in that way, the path grows wider. It's the opposite of zero sum. It's a win-win environment in which that path grows wider with each company that does it. I will also say that in some countries, you've seen a shift, at least at the top, in terms of what is required to get along with government. So, that same person that I mentioned, I'll mention the same story. The same person that you mentioned just a moment ago, Ken Njoroge, is a Kenyan. He was invited to come bid on a government contract in the Ministry of Agriculture of Nigeria, right, to develop a software to distribute some $250 million in fertilizer subsidies. So a government contract in Nigeria to help move $250 million. This is like the poster child, right, for corruption. And that's what I said to him. And so I said, I'm surprised you bid on it, because you're not, you're here, you are a Kenyan. I see the kind of business you're running in the rest of your business, which is mostly with private companies that are observing essentially FCPA requirements, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act requirements. How is it that how could you possibly have gotten comfort to take on this task in Nigeria? And he said, I wasn't comfortable. I thought that we probably would run into trouble. But what he found was that he was invited in to the bid by the Minister of Agriculture, who is this year's Forbes African Man of the Year, subsequently awarded that, by the Minister of Agriculture, who's a technocrat and agronomist, and came to meet with him, the central bank governor of Nigeria, who is another technocrat and often mentioned as one of the top central bankers in the world, and the finance minister of Nigeria, who is a former World Bank executive director. And he said that in his view, they ran the most technocratic process that he had ever seen anywhere, and thereafter sort of guided the process of the procurement to what he felt was flawless execution. Now, I know those. I happen to know those cabinet members, and they are exceptional people. Every one of those cabinets, every one of those ministries has corruption within them, and continues to have corruption within them. So I'm not going to say that the change is comprehensive, but I think you do see a change in the top of government as technocrats take positions of power. What I'm describing is uneven across the continent and uneven across time, but it is a phenomenon that over time you see growing.
So along with the whole aspect of better governance, there's still safety and security that's involved. And we've seen recent terrorist acts. You saw what happened in Kenya in the mall bombings. Is this going to become more prevalent, in your opinion? Or is it a function of this, again, inequality between those, this new technocratic class that's emerging that might be in a situation where they can start affording some luxuries, and then there's other people who still might be destitute, and it causes this instability and the ability for terrorist factions to gain root.
Yeah. So the last year has seen kind of an uptick in widespread, what I'll call political violence in parts of Africa. The overall trend line over the last 4 decades is undeniably of coups and other violent political action going down, by any measure. And there's a chart in there from The Economist that demonstrates this, that over the last 4 decades, you've just seen that steadily drop. So there has been a slight uptick this year, but let's keep an eye on the long-term trend. Not all of those are driven by economics, but I agree with you that I think economics presents the greatest risk of an increase in violence. So. To take one example, Nigeria is currently facing a growing. I'm not sure if it's even an insurrection, but a growing set of outbreaks of violence in its northern areas. The government typically associates them with a single organization that's called Boko Haram. Most likely, Boko Haram, which has fundamentalist Islamic roots, is not one organization. It's a little bit like perhaps like Al Qaeda. It's a concept. It's a philosophy. But what's very clear is that it finds fertile ground in the north because the north is consistently denied basic government services, right? And so I do think that that's an example of exactly what of the risk you're talking about. If governments do not provide public service, especially as more and more wealth is visible, I do think that kind of violence could spread. Much more of a threat in my view than Islamic radicalism itself. I'm not a deep student of religious conflict in the continent, but from what I've observed, that is less of a threat than the economic dislocation, which sometimes gets masked as fundamentalist.
And how important in this day and age across the African continent is the tribal culture? Because when you look at the way nation states were originally imposed in Africa, they went across different tribal groups, and that caused a lot of friction. Over the generations, have people become more kind of accepting of, okay, I live in this nation state as opposed to I'm part of this tribal culture, and how does that affect economic growth?
This I'm sure so. I have perspectives on this, but I feel like I've got like one hand on the elephant. First of all, because it's a big elephant. It's a big continent. Maybe elephant is not the best term in describing Africa. I try never to use animal metaphors, but they always seem to slip in a little bit. But it's a big continent with a very with an almost innumerable number of tribes and sub-tribal distinctions, right? So I can't say that I know what's going on everywhere, but also, frankly, I personally find tribal interactions quite opaque. It's hard even after 10 years, it's hard for me to know what's going on. So I'll tell you what I see, but I wouldn't want to represent it as a comprehensive picture. What I see is that I see that tribal affiliations still make a big difference in people's personal identity amongst the Africans I know, including very sophisticated people leading large African companies. I recently had a discussion with the finance minister of Nigeria, who was saying, I wish we had our own, I wish we had a unifying language in Nigeria. Because we're just torn apart, and I said, well, what about English, which is what she was speaking to me, and which I believe a majority of Nigerians speak. And she said, no, that's imposed on us. That's a colonial language. It was very much the way a Pole or a Czech might think about Russian. So even Ngozi, who is truly a global sophisticate and is interacting with the upper echelons of both Nigerian and global society, is deeply influenced by her own tribal identity and the tribal identity of everybody around her. That was, that's eye-opening. It's still very real. And I've had similar conversations in Ghana and Kenya, certainly in Guinea-Conakry and Equatorial Guinea, which are in West Africa. It's very real and present. I will say that I have also observed that in countries that have experienced strong ethnic clashes and violent clashes, there's a pronounced effort and a conscious effort to overcome that. I think I've seen that nowhere more than Kenya. I have some colleagues in the room who have spent more time in Kenya than I, but what I observed, for example, is that Kenya, which had horrific ethnic violence in their 2007 election, went to great lengths to sort of, as a society, to overcome that and dampen down those interethnic differences in their most recent election. And I think, with exceptions, they did that largely to good effect. as I say, there's others in the room who have had extensive exposure that's different and perhaps deeper than mine, but that's my experience.
And what do you think is the role of women in development in the African countries? Because they've always had a special role. How do you think they're going to be the leaders, the entrepreneurs of the future? You mentioned an executive in your book who started a cable company, and talk a little bit about the role of women.
So I think to my discredit, there is one, but only one female CEO in the book. I wanted companies that are of a certain size, but there's an insight that comes from it. One of the myths I wanted to dispel about Africa is that it's all that all of African business is a man or a woman with an ox and a sewing machine, right? That there are actually businesses at tremendous scale that are very sophisticated modern businesses in Africa. There are about $150 billion businesses in Africa today. And I wanted to, and so I looked for large companies, and the woman you're speaking of, Funkier, raised $250 million to land the first subsea fiber-optic cable, private fiber-optic cable, into Nigeria, and is now currently the leading provider of broadband to all of Nigeria. But Funkier was the exception, and I found myself thinking, well, why is that? And I asked her, I inquired a little more deeply about this, because people asked exactly this question. There are in fact a higher proportion of female CEOs in Africa than in any region of the world except the former Soviet Union, which I found an interesting stat, given that I only found one of a large company. So in fact, women are driving a lot of the economy, right? And not just with an ox and a sewing machine, but with businesses, small businesses. What I suspect is the dynamic is one you alluded to earlier. It's finance. That women entrepreneurs are finding they can only get to a certain level of growth before they are capped out by lack of an access to finance. And I suspect that what access to finance there is actually significantly gender imbalanced towards men. This is not something I've marched out with data, but based on anecdotes and looking at the data of small businesses and large businesses and women who lead both, that's my sort of current working hypothesis about why women are such a strong part of the economy, but such a small part of the commanding heights of the economy.
Interesting. So what about China? China's been in Africa, on the African continent, for decades now. Yeah. And it seems like the United States has lost a great opportunity. I mean, they've done a lot of the investments in the roads, the infrastructure, in technology, communications. Why do you think the U.S. has let Africa go by, and we haven't spent the necessary amount of development capital there?
Yeah. So Jonathan and I were speaking about this a little bit before the hour started. It could be that America is actually timing this just right for America. We are a large country, with abundant natural resources and also wealth in the economy. And it's not uncommon for American companies to grow first in the United States, and to be less internationalized than their competitors in other parts of the world. I do think that also conversely, I think that China met important commercial and geostrategic interests by moving first. China was very interested in, I think Chinese state-owned enterprises were quite interested in access to natural resources in Africa. I think they actually, in many cases, provided a reasonable trade of infrastructure and favorable financing for those resources. I actually think this has, on balance, been a good thing for Africa, which I think our statesmen often don't say, but that I think most certainly African CEOs I talk to perceive it that way. But I think that was also an activity that China wanted to take on. I don't think that the U.S. particularly had appetite to do extensive infrastructure financing in Africa. Right, as a result, those roads got built by the Chinese. Now that, as I say, that may not be a bad thing for the United States. Across those roads, U.S. made goods can roll, and we are actually seeing that dynamic right now. You'll see companies like Cummins and GE come in now with goods that are with success and goods and services that frankly would have been much harder to move under the infrastructure that existed before the Chinese came in. So my thinking on this has evolved from the U.S. really lost a step here to maybe the U.S. is coming in at just the right time. But that time is now, that if you waited another 10 years, you really would be sort of inarguably behind the curve, and probably, I would say probably in an unrecoverable way. I think that other competitors in Africa, not just China, but Malaysia, which actually has more foreign direct investment in China, in Africa than China does. I think Malaysia, Brazil, Turkey are all moving aggressively on Chinese opportunities, and on African opportunities, and that if you waited another 10 years, it'd be very difficult for U.S. companies to take advantage of it.
So we've got a 10-year window. What would you invest in? Where would you go? And what types of businesses would you start?
So broadly speaking, I would invest in for me, I would invest in the sectors that fit. I'll get specific in a second. That fit the dynamic that I described earlier of delivering productivity to a very large number of people, because that's where I think the biggest opportunities are. I also think that you're going to drive a lot of superior performance from your own people. I've witnessed that in my own firm, and you're going to be able to drive a more successful relationship with governments who are newly incented to deliver those services. And relationship with the government is critical in Africa. The state is still extremely powerful over the economies of most of the countries of Africa. So for all those reasons, I think that investments that are driving wide-scale productivity are the right way to go. What are those? Power, for sure. So all the infrastructure that I just mentioned: power, roads, rail, particularly roads and rail that are trans-border, taking advantage of some of the trans-border growth that I just described. Projects in the East African region is probably most active in the East African community in developing these sort of trans-border rail transport projects. Those strike me as attractive opportunities. Healthcare, education. We don't tend to think of these as, most people don't tend to think of these as significant growth opportunities in emerging markets. But in emerging markets, you'll see the privatization of these, not just for the rich, but also for the emerging middle class, as significant growth opportunities. And I would love to see Americans be part of that growth area as well. Those are some of the sectors that I would think for the long haul.
So we're short on time here, so we'll take one final question here. And the one that's in my mind is, I look around the audience, I see a young audience, which means that these are individuals who are looking to change the world. Is there the opportunity for them to do that in Africa? In the old days, of course, we had the Peace Corps, and everybody wanted to go out and make a difference in the Peace Corps. But there's still a lot of development work going on. What would you recommend for some of the members of our audience here who have that aspiration to go out and make something different in their life?
Yeah. So I recently had the opportunity to engage with One.org, which is Bono's NGO. They came to me when they got a copy of the book. I'm not sure how. They got a copy of the book before it was released, and they came to me and said, "We want to promote this book about CEOs and doing business in Africa." I could not have been more surprised, right? That's not how I think of Bono or his NGO. But they set me right. They said, "Listen, the way you're thinking of us is 10 years out of date. Our perspective is that private enterprise, properly regulated, properly incented, is the engine by which millions of people are going to escape poverty in Africa." Obviously, that's a view to which I subscribe. That's why I wrote the book. That's why I do the work that I do. But I think also you could work in a lot of places of the world and do good in business that way. But I think there is very few and maybe no places in the world where the scope of that opportunity to deliver social wealth while doing business, there's no place in the world that is as broad as it is in Africa today.
Well, great. Well, this concludes our program for this evening. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I ask you to join me in thanking Jonathan Berman for his excellent discussion. And I'd like to remind you that his book, Success in Africa, is available for sale, courtesy of Books Incorporated, and he will be available to sign copies on stage. Many thanks as well to you, the audience, for your terrific questions. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Thank you.